Chapter 10 of the Boy Scouts on Lost Trail by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Spud Gets His Buck. It seemed to Spud that he had hardly closed his eyes when he was awakened by a vigorous shake and opened them to find Pat, fully dressed, leaning over him. It was still dark, but in the east a faint glow gave a warning that the break of day was close at hand. A quick but hearty breakfast of bacon, fried potatoes, and cocoa was eaten, and with a few crackers and raisins in their pockets, for Pat proposed to make a day of it if luck failed them in the morning, they were ready to start. As a matter of course, Spud got his rifle, but Pat bade him leave it for one of the others to use if they desired, pointing out that it would be a useless encumbrance. "But I might pick up a grouse or two," protested Spud. "And scare every deer within a mile," retorted Pat with withering sarcasm. "When it be deer ye be huntin', 'tis deer ye hunt, and 'tis not the likes of that popgun that will be bringin' one home." So empty-handed Spud fell in behind Pat, and if something of the keen edge of the anticipations of the night before had been lost, who can blame him? With one gun for two men, and that in the other fellow's hands, half the pleasure of the hunt is lost. At least, that is the way Spud felt. Had not Pat said that there was a buck awaiting him in Smuggler's Hollow? And did not that imply that he was to have a chance to do the shooting? Yet here he was, empty-handed. Suppose they should jump a buck? Pat would get it. And as one would give him all the meat needed, there would be no more hunting for big game. But if Spud was chagrined and a little bitter at heart, he made no sign, and Pat little guessed the disappointment that was masked by the cheerful grin of the sunshine-maker. Pat had hunted that country before, and knowledge of the country is one of the first essentials in successful hunting, particularly when in quest of big game. It saves time and useless effort, and at the same time increases the chances of success by making it possible to anticipate with some degree of certainty the probable course the game will take. So where Spud, had he been left to himself, would have tramped the woods aimlessly on the chance of jumping a deer, Pat now led straight for a certain hardwood ridge to the north, and about 3/4 of a mile from camp. "'Tis working up from the lowlands the base will be, and 'tis ourselves must be there to give them a proper reception," he explained. They crossed the brook just below the camp, and then went directly up the ridge. From time to time, Pat carefully tested the light air by wetting a finger and holding it aloft. It was blowing straight in their faces as they stood on the ridge, looking down into the valley, which was much to Pat's liking, for it meant that there was no danger of being winded by any deer that might be below them. He now began to work along the ridge slowly and carefully, putting each foot down as if walking on eggs, seemingly without effort. There was no sound, for the leaves underfoot were wet and sodden with the heavy night dew, and he avoided as by instinct the sticks which would break and snap under his weight. Not so Spud. Telling about it afterward, he said, "Tried my darndest to avoid sticks, but the more I tried the less luck I had, it seemed to me, and each one snapped louder than the others. Pat would step on a stick and never make a sound, but when I stepped on one, the same one, I'm hanged, if the thing wouldn't crack like a pistol shot. And yet I don't weigh as much as Pat. It sure got my goat for a little while." This was because Spud had not learned the art of still walking in the woods, for it is an art, and nothing less. His very anxiety, resulting in a continuous, conscious effort, tended to defeat his purpose. The elaborate effort to set each foot down carefully resulted in resting the entire weight of the body solidly on each foot alternately, whereas with Pat, moving with an easy, light, springy step, the weight was so distributed that it was carried through the entire step, never resting solidly on a given point. Then again, long practice had made it second nature for Pat to feel out the ground with his moccasined feet, and to instinctively know when a stick would bear his weight and when it would not. So, while his whole mind was concentrated on the finding of his game, and every sense was on the alert, he moved forward confidently and silently, until it seemed to the despairing Spud that those feet ahead of him were quite independent and did their own thinking. As for Spud's own feet, they were perverse. If there was a rotten stick within possible reach of them, they found it, and it snapped with a report sure to bring Pat's head around with a warning frown. It was getting on his nerves. Finally, they reached a point midway between two runs or paths made by deer following the same course day by day and going to and from their feeding grounds or drinking places. "Sit down on that log and keep the two eyes of you peeled both ways," ordered Pat, putting the rifle in Spud's hands. "I be going to bait the thicket below, and if Mr. Peekatoes is there, as I suspect he be, he will likely come out of the run we have just passed, or else of the other one, which is a matter of 250 yards farther along the ridge, just this side of the big yeller birch beyond. Stay where you be, for the chances are that 'tis the nearest run he will be taking, but keep the eyes of you on the watch every minute, and if you see the brush moving down below in the direction of the other run, sneak along the ridge to within 100 yards. You will have to judge the distance and set the sights accordingly. But whatever you do, don't shoot until you know what you be shooting at. 'Tis a fool who shoots at moving brush, and that kills men, and I have no desire that you be trying the thrick on me. Just remember that I be somewhere below you, and be sure you be holding on Mr. Buck before you pull the trigger. Hold low and just back of the shoulder, and forget that it be a deer at all. Just think you be on the rifle range at woodcraft and make a bull's-eye. If a deer be badly frightened, he will come on the jump, and most like you will hear him coming. But if he do but just get the wind of me, and is only suspicious, he'll try to steal away, and most like you'll see him before you hear him. He'll be watching down below, and 'tis more than even chance that when he reaches the top of the ridge, he will stand a few minutes to look back. Take your time and make sure of him. If I start anything, I will give the caw of a crow once. A deer hunter, like a good scout, must always be prepared, and remember that you be both this day." Pat now took his back track and was soon lost to view. It was his intention to make a wide detour and work along the edge of the swamp at the foot of the ridge, and then gradually up. He would then be windward of any game which had already left the swamp. A deer catching his scent would at once work up the ridge with an excellent chance that Spud would get a shot. Left to himself, Spud sat with every nerve keyed up to the highest pitch. He was to have his chance after all, but now he was not so sure he wanted it. What if he should miss? What if the deer should get past without him seeing it? Would he be able to gauge the distance? It was one thing to kill a deer in imagination, and quite another thing altogether to be actually sitting in a momentary expectation of having a deer appear. He nervously wondered if he was so sure of his skill with a rifle after all. How still it was! There was not a sound to denote that there was any other living creature in all that wilderness. At first, things in the distance had been indistinct in the gray of dawn, but now the light was creeping through the forest rapidly. Through a break in the trees, he could see the top of the opposite ridge, bathed in the clear yellow light of the rising sun. Presently a yellow-bellied sapsucker beat his reveille on the hollow stub of a dead pine, and Spud realized how jumpy his nerves were, for at the abrupt breaking of the silence he had all but dropped the rifle. A jay screamed harshly. The forest was awakening. What had become of Pat? It seemed as if he had been gone hours. Would he find anything down there? Perhaps there were no deer on this ridge at all, and he would have his long wait for nothing. Presently, as he shifted the rifle to an easier position, he realized that he had been holding himself so tense that his strained muscles were now all of a shake, and this would not do at all. Ah, what was that? The caw of a crow far down below. Was it the signal, or had some fool crow chosen that particular place to salute the sun? He strained his ears for a repetition, but there was none, and he felt sure then that it was the signal. Once more he resumed his rigid attitude, gripping the rifle as if he feared it was to be torn from his grasp. Anxiously and intently he scanned the brush below for some movement, his ears strained for the snap of a stick or some other telltale sound. The minutes wore on. The forest resumed its death-like stillness. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. It must be that Pat was mistaken. Unconsciously, Spud relaxed. If there was a deer below, he would have shown himself before this. What could Pat be doing? He wished that he would hurry up so that he could try their luck somewhere else. It was disappointing after such a long wait not to even have a glimpse of game. Ha! What was that moving just this side of the nearest run? Once more he gripped his rifle tensely, his eyes glued on the spot where he thought he had detected a slight movement. Then a cock grouse stepped into view and stood motionless, looking down the slope. With a sigh of disappointment, Spud scowled at the handsome bird. Then slowly he lifted the rifle until it covered the unsuspecting cause of his rudely dashed hopes. "I've a great mind to blow you to kingdom come," he growled, "just for not being a deer." He was still watching the grouse when a faint, distant snap back of him caused him to turn quickly. There on the top of a ridge, 100 yards distant, stood a handsome buck. He had been watching his back trail, but at Spud's first move he had wheeled and was now looking straight at him, head up, nostrils distended, eyes wide with startled wonder. For perhaps 10 seconds hunter and hunted stared at each other, Spud too surprised to remember the rifle in his hands, the buck curious and uncertain. Then with a sharp whistle and a magnificent leap over a fallen tree, the beautiful animal was gone. Too late, Spud came out of his trance. He threw forward the rifle, but one glimpse of a white tail was all that he was afforded, and sadly he realized that he had had his chance and missed it. He had been tried and found wanting. Big as he was, tears of disappointment and mortification were very near the surface. What would Pat think of him? What should he tell the other fellows when he got back to camp? "They won't do a thing to me now after all my bragging," he muttered. "Serves me right. It wouldn't be so bad if we didn't need the meat. What an ass I was to sit there watching that fool grouse. Confound him. I wish I had blown his head off. No, I don't either. That wouldn't have gotten me the deer." His thoughts were still running in a bitter vein when Pat appeared. "What's the matter with the sunshine maker?" he demanded as he viewed Spud's gloomy face. "You must not let a little thing like disappointment over not getting a shot eat the heart out of you. I started a big buck down on the edge of a swamp, but the foxy chap must have taken another run." "But he didn't," growled Spud miserably. "He came right out and stood on top of the ridge, as pretty a shot as you ever saw, and I never saw him until he was there. And then I was so surprised that I forgot to shoot until it was too late." Spud blurted the confession out hurriedly. Pat's eyes twinkled. Instead of the anger and reproaches which Spud had prepared himself for, there was only a hearty laugh. "Don't take it to heart, my boy. You beat out the first one I've known to be so interested in admiring his first deer that he misremembered the gun in his hands. There's no harm done, not even to the buck, and he is not the only one in the woods. I think we'll move on a bit before it gets too dry. Forget it now, and you will shoot all the straighter for it the next time." The young woodsman gave Spud a hearty slap on the back as he spoke, and at once led the way along the ridge. That was a disappointing day to Spud. He realized for the first time that hunting may become real work. To be sure, it was relieved for a long time by the excitement of constant anticipation, but by noon this had given way to discouragement, and he realized that the strain of the constant effort to move noiselessly had tired him more than his ordinary hike of twice the distance would have. As they sat on a log for a noon rest and munched their crackers and raisins, Spud frankly confessed that he was ready to give it up and go back to camp. The bitterness of his lost chance still rankled deeply, and to add to this there had been one other incident which had added to his sense of humiliation. While crossing a burnt-over track, they had jumped another deer. Spud had thrown forward his rifle at the first jump, only to find that he was shaking as with the ague, and the sights rested anywhere but on the bounding gray form. Nevertheless, he would have fired but for Pat's sharp command, "Don't shoot!" Then, and not until then, he saw that it was a doe. He had been too excited to note the sex at all. Pat had said nothing at the time, but now as they stretched out in the sun, he referred to the incident. "'Twas an arrow escape Mrs. Lightfoot was after having a while back," he remarked by way of an opening, a twinkle in his blue eyes. "Narrow escape nothing," grunted Spud. "Why, I wouldn't have hit the broadside of a barn, let alone that jumping jack. The sight of the end of the rifle was doing a regular Irish jig." Pat, what's the matter with me? I never made such an ass of myself before. Why, I've scored over 90 out of a possible 100 more than once on the range in competition, and with a whole crowd looking on. I guess I'm not well, or something is the matter." Pat laughed long and heartily. "'Tis buck fever that ails you, my boy, and nothing else. 'Tis buck fever, nothing else. 'Tis a complaint most hunters are likely to have with their first big game. I have seen a man shoot 6 feet over a standing buck at 30 yards and then pump his magazine empty without putting a bullet within 10 feet of the beast. 'Tis one thing to shoot at the mark and another thing to point your gun at a living creature and it ready to spring at the first sign of danger, or to be already on the jump. I've had it myself. 'Twas the first time I ever met a bear, and I reckon the spalpeen be laughing yet whenever he do be thinking of the boy who tore all the bark from the side of an innocent tree 5 feet to the one side of him and 3 feet above him. A queer disease it is, but 9 men in every 10 have it the first time they try to hold a gun on a deer. Some never get over it, but most of 'em do, and you will be one of 'em. When you've killed a fat buck, you will forget you ever had the chills, and by the same token, you never will have 'em again." "I guess it's a kind of stage fright," said the somewhat comforted Spud. "I don't know what that may be, but I guess it is," replied Pat dryly. "You take the rifle this afternoon, Pat. It's our only chance to get meat today, and you know the fellows are counting on a venison steak," said Spud. "Not a bit, will I?" retorted Pat. "'Twas a buck I promised you, and 'twas yourself that promised to get it, did I lead you to it. And the day is young yet. We'll be taking it easy here for an hour or 2 yet. 'Tis what the beasts themselves be doing. They be lying down on the highland, but about 4 o'clock they'll be moving again, working down into the hollows toward the swamps. When they do, it is the sunshine maker and crack shot of the lone wolves will be waiting for them." Despite Pat's optimism, it seemed as if Spud was not to be granted another chance. They crossed the brook and skirted the edge of the swamp on the other side, Pat believing that because of the direction of the wind and because the deer would be working down instead of up, their chances of a successful shot would be better than if they worked back over the same ground they had covered in the morning. Tracks they saw in plenty, but that was all. The long shadows of late afternoon were beginning to creep into the valley when they reached a point half a mile from camp and sat down on the edge of the swamp to rest. Spud had given up all hope and sat in despondent silence. He had so wanted to get a deer, and he knew that this day was his only opportunity. He moodily watched an eagle winging its way toward a mountain at the head of the valley and lived over again his fiasco of the early morning. Suddenly Pat nudged him. "I have a notion to see if you can hold steady on a fixed mark," said he in a low tone that he had used all day during the hunt. "Do you see that little patch of gray in the opening between the 2 birches to the right of that windfall, 100 yards up the ridge? Let me see you put a ball in the middle of it." Spud looked as directed and saw the little patch of gray. It looked much like a bit of weather-worn bark. He was glad of anything to break his gloomy thoughts, and moreover, here was a chance to show Pat he really could shoot. Lifting the rifle, he sighted carefully and noted with inward satisfaction that there was not a tremor in his hands. At the report there was a sudden and startling commotion behind the screen of the windfall, a sound as if some heavy animal leaping away, a crash, and then silence. Spud turned and looked stupidly at Pat, but the latter was already on his feet and starting for the windfall. "Come on, boy! You got him! And 'tis hard hit he is, but be ready to give him another shot if need be," he shouted. Mechanically Spud threw another cartridge into place and followed Pat, still in a daze. "What is it, Pat? I don't understand. Did I hit something back of the windfall?" he panted as he plunged after the young woodsman. It took but a few minutes to reach the windfall and round the upper end of it. Pat was first, and his whoop of delight told Spud that the prize, whatever it was, would need no second shot. Panting with excitement, he burst through the brush and then stopped with a gasp of sheer astonishment and incredulity. Pat was stooping over a fat buck. The animal was quite dead, and Pat had already drawn his knife to bleed it. "'Twas a fine shot, my son. I could not have made a better shot myself, and 'tis proud I am to be guiding for the likes of you." Mate and plenty we'll be after having. What ails you, man? Pat appeared to notice for the first time the dazed expression of his companion. Pat, said Spud solemnly, come over here and kick me till I wake up. I didn't shoot that deer. I didn't see it at all. Then may old Satan become a saint, exclaimed the other, laughing heartily. You not only shot it, but you saw it before you shot. Did you not shoot at a little patch of gray? Yes, but did you know that was a deer all the time? A sudden suspicion took possession of Spud. Again Pat's hearty laugh rolled out. Then he told Spud how he had seen the buck come over the ridge and leisurely work down to the windfall. There he had stood. Pat, fearing that if he should tell Spud what he was shooting at, the latter would have return of the buck fever, had resorted to the simple plan which had worked out so well. From the position of the animal, he knew that if Spud hit at all, the shot was likely to prove fatal, as had been the case. The ball had passed through just back of the left shoulder and, quartering, had reached the heart. Now, he concluded, you have your buck, and 'tis the last of the fever that you be having, I do be thinking. And Spud felt in his heart that it was so. It was a fine 6-point buck, and Spud mourned that he could not take out the head to have mounted as a trophy. But this was impossible, though Pat promised that he should have the horns. The animal was soon bled and drawn, and then with 4 feet lashed together he was slung from a stout sapling and suspended between them, and they began their triumphant march to camp. Needless to say, they received a royal reception. The deer was skinned, and soon a savory steak was broiling over the coals. After dinner, when all hands were gathered round the campfire, the story of the hunt was demanded. Spud had been dreading this, for though he had got his buck, he was not at all proud of his day's record. It was Pat who told the story, and he lauded the lone wolf cook and sunshine maker to the skies. There was not a hint about the big buck of the early morning, nor of the jumping of the doe and the attack of buck fever, and Spud blushed as Pat described as only he could the successful shot, giving all the credit to the young hunter. When he had finished, there were congratulations all over again until Spud's ears burned and he could stand it no longer. Jumping to his feet, he demanded that he be heard. Half a story is no story at all. Pat has told but half, but the other half is different, he cried. Then, in his own inimitable way, he told the story over again, and his comrades roared with laughter as he described his feelings when he discovered the big buck, and again when he illustrated the shakes of buck fever. Spud was a good storyteller, and now he spared himself not at all. Never mind, Spud, old man, you got the buck, cried Hal, wiping the tears from his eyes. I doubt I could have done that. And think of the feast we'll have, cried Plimpton. I propose 3 cheers for Spud Eli the Only, original cook, sunshine maker, storyteller, and mighty hunter of the lone wolves. The cheers were given with a will, and to have heard them you never would have guessed that they hid more than one pang of disappointment, for all the chances for another hunt were ended by the success of the first one. End of chapter 10.